I can say with confidence that one of the worst things you can do in a hack and slash, yes, I refuse to use the term character action, is having unblockable attacks. This trend seems really popular, especially amongst Western devs. Japanese devs always had a tendency to let the game speak for itself. It doesn't matter if the camera clips through the wall, we're not forcing you into a cutscene to perform a special attack. The show must go on. On a related note, CastleVania Lords of Shadows was a surprisingly decent clone of God of War and Devil May Cry that received a sequel that was mostly badly received. Upon further inspection, it's actually not that bad. The spin on the story is interesting. The art design is superb and so is the music. However, it's still inferior to its predecessor, and one of the things that I noticed that or the experience is the abundance of unblockable attacks. A superior title like Devil May Cry will simply let you do as you please. Certain attacks are more dangerous than others, but it's up to you to assess whether you want to parry an attack or avoid it altogether. When not done, it just feels like you're stopping the combat. Your offensive and defensive repertoire doesn't matter anymore, you just have to wait for the enemy to stop. It doesn't feel clever and often leads to damage you would otherwise avoid because you try to parry or block. It also doesn't help that these games like to have more tracking in their animations than Dark Souls. You end up having adversaries adjusting at the end of an attack to land shots that otherwise wouldn't. God of War 2017 was full of that. Here it's not as bad but quite noticeable. It was hard to learn patterns in God of War when enemies change properties of their attacks mid-swing. We're not dealing with different patterns, just the game bending around its own system. It's often a lack of adequate gameplay systems that lead to these. The same way certain games will insert QuickTime events or turret sections to make up for a lack of depth. These moments are used to distract from the lack of combat difficulty. Recall Devil May Cry 4. Its QuickTime events still required you to actually use the same inputs you would in-game, even those moments that were more similar to cutscenes. To throw back a projectile, you had to show prowess. It really pushes that notion that Western devs are more spectacle-focused and Japan more skill-based. Certain trends came and went, but that one still has to die. The final fight of the DLC of Lord of Shadows 2 Revelations was a particularly good argument as to why that trend should cease. That game likes you to win cinematic sequences in order to progress, and what felt like an already restrictive system became worse. Failing to push off the final boss from a chandelier resulted in me having to redo entire sequences of the fight, where the final boss would teleport into unblockable attacks. There was nothing to do but wait, and in that moment, none of the systems came into play. I lowered down the difficulty. Like in God of War, it felt more like the enemies were cheating more than anything. The Dark Souls tracking didn't help. Unengaged, I finished a somewhat decent DLC and kept on with the main campaign. A decent game, but not quite in the heights of the first. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance also had unblockable attacks for their enemies, but they were telegraphed a lot better, and you really had time to assess whether or not you wanted to block or dodge. While here it's not quite as good, and the enemies don't feel well telegraphed, and the camera sometimes is ironically pulled too far back, and you really have that feeling that you're simply being cheated on and you simply have to wait for an enemy to finish whatever they're doing, like in boss fights where you have an enemy pulling off a sequence and you just have to wait until they're vulnerable again. It's quite unengaging. Alucard has that swag on point.
Father will awake in a few hours.